focus of my talk today is more the practical aspects of the problem of Homeland Security or police state. We're with the Department of Criminal Justice, and the department, if you're not aware of it, the response to terrorism in the United States today is primarily a local response. There are federal initiatives, but the responsibility for dealing with public safety and Homeland Security has fallen onto local agencies, and criminal justice programs throughout the United States have been involved. With our department, and I just mentioned this as an aside, is that we're involved in democratic police training in Russia, and we have some experience with the question of Homeland Security in a different perspective, I guess, because we're training police officers, senior police officers in the Udmurt Republic in democratic and human rights policing, or policing that respects human rights. And they're being transferred after the training that we provide to Chechnya to do, and if any of you are following what's happening in the Chechen Republic, the former Soviet Unions has their soldiers are Russian soldiers now, and the Russian soldiers are having a very difficult time fighting the Chechen terrorists, and the police have been brought in to try to back up the military. And so we're in a peculiar situation that we're, on one hand, teaching human rights and democratic policing to police officers in Russia, and they're coming back with tales of what the problems that they're facing in Chechnya. And if any of you are watching the international news, you know that there have been a series of terrorist acts within Russia in the past several months, most notably the taking over of an opera house with hundreds of hostages taken, and then the response, which was a local response to recapturing the opera house, and they killed, I think, 120 of the hostages in the process. So the practical aspect, criminal justice deals with the practical aspect as opposed to the theoretical aspect of Homeland Security and terrorism. And today I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the challenge of terrorism in the United States and the threat and response, and what local agencies, what the expectation are for local agencies. Right before I came here, I went to the homepage of the Department of Homeland Security, and you can all access it if you go to the internet, and you'll see that the national threat level has been raised with the invasion of Iraq, and the Department of Homeland Security, in consultation with the Homeland Security Council, has made the decision to raise the national threat level from elevated to high risk of terrorist attack, or level orange. And what this means is it sends a message to all the local criminal justice agencies throughout the United States that the intelligence community believes that terrorists will attempt multiple attacks against the U.S. and coalition targets worldwide in the event of a U.S.-led military campaign against Saddam Hussein. A large volume of reporting across a range of sources, some of which are highly reliable, indicate that al-Qaeda probably would attempt to launch terrorist attacks against U.S. interests, claiming they were defending Muslims or the Iraqi people rather than Saddam Hussein's regime. That's the message. The other part that you don't see is this message goes out to the local communities, but they don't tell them what to do or how to respond. They ask them to be vigilant. And our local criminal justice systems, particularly in Orange County and Central Florida, I think are doing an excellent job by bringing together, creating task forces and trying to bring together emergency management, fire, law enforcement. And while if you're not aware of law enforcement in the United States, there are multiple levels of law enforcement. And until 9/11 came along, they didn't communicate with one another. And you'll have local, state, and federal, and a major step has been to bring those people together to share information, to coordinate policy, to try to enhance public safety across the board. And I just wanted to share with you some of those threats that are out there. And one of the major threats that have been talked about and communicated is the threat of biochemical terrorist attacks. How many of you have heard about biochemical terrorist attacks or the threats thereof? And they're communicating the message that there's a threat out there, but they're not really, and there's some training taking place to help first responders to deal with this problem. And I just wanted to share with you some of the evidence that they've picked up, and this is unclassified information, but information that shows that there's some activity out there. And in the past several months, I'll give you an example. In Europe, in December 2002, Al-Qaeda and Chechen rebels attempted to blow up the Russian embassy in Paris, and the police broke it up, and they found explosive materials, including cyanide gas. In January 2003, there was a North London raid in England, and 6 Algerian men were arrested, and ricin was found, and there was a plot to take the ricin and introduce it into the food supply in a military base in England. So we have ricin and cyanide. We also have ricin has also been found in Afghanistan in training camps with directions, recipes in terms of how to produce it. And the good news, bad news about ricin is it's easy to produce and manufacture, and it is deadly, but its impact is one has to ingest it individually. So in order for it to have a mass impact, you have to inject it into a food supply in a mass way to have mass casualties. And what they suspect its use is going to be, or attempted use will be, to use it on symbolic targets and use the resulting publicity to try to emphasize the danger of the drug. They've also found ricin associated in the preparation of ricin with Kurdish groups in northern Iraq. And this is Kurdish groups that are not affiliated with Saddam Hussein, but part of the unaffiliated Kurdish extremists that have been identified in the past as engaging in terrorist activity. We've also found in Spain, Algerian, Moroccan militants have been linked to Chechen network, and they, again, have been found with cyanide in the attempted production of cyanide. And there's been an attempt to introduce that to use it as an attack weapon. And some of you probably come across this past case where Moroccans were attempting to introduce cyanide into the water system of the U.S. Embassy in Rome, Italy. So there's been some evidence that there's been chemical warfare or chemical ingredients out there, and the system is trying to respond. But the dimensions, the use of these chemicals, we anticipate their use, but they haven't been used in the United States. We don't have evidence that they've been used in the United States by these extremist groups. However, they have been used in the United States. Ricin has been used by the American Patriot groups. And we have homegrown terrorists within the United States that have experimented with chemical weapons, and it's just not the Islamic extremists who are waging a war against the U.S. where chemical ingredients have been found. There's also another major problem involved in this biochemical, and some people suggest nuclear, it has to do, and there's been some movies on this in terms of containers that come into the United States. Has anybody seen any of those movies? Well, the reality is that 21,000 containers that are approximately 40 or 60 feet long come into the United States every day, and they're offloaded. And until recently, 99% of them weren't searched. And as you can see, the Hollywood speculation is somebody gets a hold of one of these containers someplace in another part of the world, puts a nuclear device into it and brings it into a port in the United States and it's exploded. That's a very real danger, and the U.S. Customs department has developed a mechanism now to track these containers, to see where they're coming from, where they stop, and there is some steps taken to examine the impact of, to examine these containers. But it's a very real threat, and I wanted to share with you a couple of the things that people are worried about these days in terms of Homeland Security with this orange alert. A couple other things that are going on. There's a fear that soft targets are going to be attacked in the United States. And what is a soft target? A soft target is a group that's not protected. And in recent months, they've talked about school systems, playgrounds, et cetera, and there have been increased vigilance. It's been ratcheted up at school systems and hospitals, places where a lot of civilians congregate. There's a fear that some action might be taken against those targets. Within the United States, again, I mentioned that the response is primarily a local response, and we're seeing, I think the state of Florida is leading the country in terms of coordinating activities between state, local, and federal agencies to try to maintain public safety and increase a level of vigilance to make sure that terrible attacks don't take place. And I want to mention that the United States government identifies 3 types of international terrorist threats that are out there. They also identify domestic terrorist threats that we have, and I want to point out that in this time of post-September 11th, I don't want us to forget that there are domestic terrorists, and I haven't mentioned this as a chemical attack, but you can all remember the anthrax attacks that followed September 11th, and the person or groups that committed those anthrax attacks in the mail system, they haven't been apprehended yet. There's a strong suspicion that they're homegrown terrorists and not international terrorists. So we have a complicated mess out there in terms of, trying to respond to a particular terrorist threat. And so, for the purposes of from a criminal justice perspective, I guess we divide terrorist threats into 2 different categories: international and domestic, and respond accordingly. In terms of international threat, there's 3 main groups that the FBI identifies: loosely affiliated extremists that are motivated by political or religious beliefs, and they may pose an urgent threat to the United States. They're loosely affiliated. They move around. They join different groups. They form coalitions. Recently, several months ago, for example, they found terrorists from the IRA training terrorist drug dealers in Colombia. And that's a connection that surprised a lot of people because of just the connection of how the 2 groups would come together. And we're finding that they may act as mercenaries, and they share information. There's also formal terrorist groups, autonomous, generally transnational organizations that have their own infrastructures, personnel, financial arrangements, and training facilities. And probably the largest one that I'm aware of is Hezbollah. And they operate in the Mideast, but they also have strong fundraising and recruiting mechanisms in the United States and in South America. Our department also does some training of police in Uruguay, and there's an area in South America between Brazil, Uruguay, and some other places. That's a area that funds have been raised to support Hezbollah activities. There's been major law enforcement crackdowns on Hezbollah in alleged fundraising activities in North Carolina involving various criminal enterprises, and money was raised and sent to support Hezbollah. And if you watch the newspaper, you'll see that there's action being taken by federal authorities to crack down on the fundraising activities. We also have state-sponsored. We have countries, state sponsors of terrorism, or countries that view terrorism as a tool of foreign policy. And presently, the Department of State lists 7 countries as state sponsors of terrorism, and these include Iraq, which we're taking care of right now, Iran, Sudan, Libya, Syria, Cuba, and North Korea. And I want to point out that for those of you not familiar with Florida, as you go down to Key West, and just 90 miles away is Cuba. And, you know, since 9/11, we've taken some very aggressive stands towards anti-terrorism and trying to create a protective shield around the United States, and yet a gunboat from Cuba was able to land, dock in a dock in Key West, and the soldiers got off the gunboat, walked into town, pulled out cigars, had a few cervezas, and turned themselves over to the local authorities. And our early warning system didn't detect them. And if there's a major weakness, I mean, there are some major weaknesses in our response to dealing with terrorism. I wanted to briefly talk about, before I turn things over to Jerome, the issue of the domestic threat. And I don't want us to forget the domestic threat. I've been teaching a course on terrorism since about 1978, and I've dealt with, the topics have dealt with left-wing terrorists, right-wing terrorists, and various special interest group terrorists. And today, the right-wing extremist groups are much more active than the left-wing extremist groups. And you're hearing with the return of that young lady in Salt Lake City, Smart, the Smart family has received their daughter back. And some people are starting to talk about Patty Hearst, and remember what happened to Patty Hearst and the Symbionese Liberation Army and the brainwashing that may have taken place, and how Patty Hearst was involved in bank robbery. And I think we need to take a look at Patty Hearst's situation and some of the explanations that came up then to explain what happened to this young lady in Salt Lake City that was taken, that was kidnapped and taken by that person on that they've arrested. But we still have some left-wing groups raising Cain. The Red Army in, or the Red Brigade in Italy just had a shootout, so they're not completely dead. And there are some Marxist-inspired groups that are active. They're not so active in the United States. There are Puerto Rican extremist groups that have been active in the past. I think our last panel talked about one of the best responses to terrorism that a government can embrace, and that's democracy and involvement of the people in making decisions. And I think that when we take a look at the Puerto Rican situation, the way we responded to the problems that Puerto Ricans had with the bombing of Vieques, and how we responded to removing the military and how that was negotiated out, probably prevented a terrorist campaign from being mounted against U.S. interests. And then we have special interest extremist groups. We don't hear much about them today, but there are a couple of people on death row in the state of Florida for killing abortion providers. We have environmental terrorists, and if any of you ski and you happen to go to Vail, Colorado, development people burned the top of, they burned a huge facility at the top of Vail Mountain. They, from time to time, attack developers and attack places where they attack people who wish to degrade the environment. We have right-wing terrorists in our midst in Central Florida, in this great state of Florida. They appear every once in a while, and there's usually a prompt response to them. The right-wing terrorists, we would do well to keep in mind that they are still active. The FBI in around the year 2000, they identified 7 planned mass casualty attacks in the United States, and most of those were organized by right-wing extremist groups. So they are out there. They tend to be overshadowed by Al-Qaeda and our concern about Al-Qaeda, but we have homegrown terrorists. And with that, I think I'll turn things over to Jerome Randall. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Just to follow up, I'm going to touch on, excuse me, I'm going to continue and talk about some current trends in terrorism, and I'll be brief. I know we don't have the most of time here, but thank you for that introduction, may I say. I do bring a military background into the classroom, and I spent some time in Europe during the 70s and 80s when terrorism was really at its peak. I remember groups like the Red Army faction, the Red Brigade. As a matter of fact, I remember specifically when they kidnapped the general over there and some of the tactics that they used to transport him from location A to location B. Nevertheless, but when I look at terrorism today, how it has evolved, because it is a very, very dynamic process, and it has evolved. And so I look at some of the trends today and some of the methods that we use to counter terrorism. We have changed, and we have to change in our response to terrorism. But anyway, some of the current trends in terrorism. We have weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction, you're hearing a lot being said about this in the news today. And certainly 9/11, when we look at 9/11, and we've heard this so much, but we never really thought that our own commercial aircrafts would be used to inflict mass casualty on the United States. Even though in the military we train extensively for those types of incidents. Today, terrorists are using technology. With the emerging technology, this makes us vulnerable. It adds to the vulnerabilities of the United States. And so the FBI is responding certainly with counterterrorism, and there are many ways, many processes that they are using to counter threats of terrorism. We do have to be concerned, like Dr. McCarthy said, about domestic terrorism as well as international terrorism. Time won't permit me to go into all of some of the aspects, some of the various aspects that I wanted to go into. But when we look at the FBI in terms of counterterrorism, the idea is to establish the capacity, and we're talking about prioritizing, establishing and maintaining a sound and productive relationship with external counterparts and intelligence, so that you can get that flow of information. You can have the intelligence sharing, so that we can work together as a single entity to counter the threat of terrorism. That's what it's going to take. Now, when we look at some of the challenges of terrorism, fear. I brought something here from Franklin D. Roosevelt's first inaugural address, 1933. And I know there was some conversation about fear earlier, but he writes, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, reasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." And this is from Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1933. And that fear is here today because that's what terrorism does. That's the central weapon of terrorism, is to generate fear in us. And fear, being in criminal justice, we talk about crime and how crime can inflict fear on people. Well, terrorism certainly, look at 9/11. It makes us prisoners in our own home, and we can't allow terrorism to do this to us. We have to come together as a people, as a democracy, and embrace ourselves against terrorism. Because if we allow this to happen, then the terrorists have won. They have certainly won without striking a single blow. So I found that to be quite interesting. Right quickly, when we do continuing with fear, after 9/11, just quickly, there was a call to return to business as usual. As a matter of fact, I was in my classroom the morning of September 11, 2001. And I remember one of my students coming, rushing into the classroom, screaming, saying they've attacked us, they've attacked us. I was totally surprised. But anyway, after that happened, there was a call to return to business as usual, but that just wasn't to be. As a matter of fact, by January 2002, we still had not returned to business as usual. And the fear that choked the nation was not only in the private entity, but it was in the public discourse as well. And so in response to that, Congress passed somewhere around 400, I believe it was somewhere around 450 counterterrorism resolutions, bills, and amendments compared to, at least they proposed these, and this was compared to somewhere around 1,300 in the total course of history. So we are a reactive kind of society, but I think 9/11 is going to make us more of a proactive. Well, it has made us more of a proactive, at least it's putting us into more of a proactive role against terrorism. We like to emphasize being proactive in the criminal justice arena. Granted, it takes a little more effort and resources, but prevention is the key when you take a proactive approach. Anyway, so some of the other issues here, we look at issues of civil liberties, and you're going to hear that. Anytime you're trying to balance security against safety versus security, versus civil liberties, you're going to have some violations of civil liberties. It may not be done intentionally, but it does tend to happen. I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is to make sure that we don't, there's a very delicate balance between countering terrorism and maintaining civil liberties. So we have to make sure that we try to balance those two as much as possible. Now, some of the other issues that came to light after 9/11, post 9/11, were detention and questioning of terrorist suspects. This was a big concern because anyone who was considered to be of reasonable suspicion could be detained and questioned, and there was an unspecified period of time, so that generated some concerns. And then military tribunals, when the United States announced those, there were criticism from within the United States as well as abroad. And then capital punishment was an area of concern. Proponents of capital punishment said, hey, retribution, acts of terrorism warrant capital punishment because the punishment fits the crime. Now, on the other hand, you have opponents who say capital punishment is not a deterrent to crime. Look at your everyday criminal. Terrorists are not going to be deterred by capital punishment or the death penalty. So these are just some issues. And then some further concerns. National security certainly becomes a broad justification. These are concerns that citizens have, but national security becomes a rather broad justification for any number of actions that are taken on the basis of information because it isn't available to the public in the name of national security. One of the things that we need to be careful about is that these drastic measures in response to 9/11, that they could play into the hands of the terrorists, and therefore they could alienate individuals who were not previously involved. So we do have to make sure that we don't isolate some of our potential friends here in the United States as well as abroad. And with that, I am going to turn you all over to the next panelist. Thank you.
At this point, the discussion has been the response to the threat or the reality of terrorism through legislation, through direct action. As pointed out by Dr. McCarthy, most of it does take place at the local level, which without a blueprint probably is not a bad idea because we really don't know how to respond to terrorism, and we're going to need a lot of local experimentation, if you will, varying approaches as we assess what works best at the level where people are most familiar with the communities that they serve. On the other hand, we also have to recognize that terrorism comes from somewhere. It's not an isolated incident. It doesn't simply occur in a vacuum. And Dr. Qadri has presentation that discusses a differing approach to responding to terrorism through relationships and education. Dr. Qadri.
Thank you. Greetings of peace unto you. It is a great privilege to be here today, and I thank the organizers of the Lou Frey Foundation for giving me this opportunity. I'm not an expert in politics, government policies, or homeland security, but I'm here as an educator to give you a different perspective of what all of this means to us. And when I say us, I'm introducing myself as an American citizen, although I may not look one. President Bush once said at the 14th Annual World Pork Expo at Iowa, "If you are interested in fighting evil, do some good." And Secretary Ridge, the head of the Department of Home Security, had said, "At the very heart of our efforts is prevention." And today, in my very brief presentation, I would like to emphasize on how, as educators and teachers, we can teach our children and our students about prevention and how we can better prepare them to combat terrorism. I was very happy to hear some of the other views. In fact, Mr. John Bercier's presentation had very similar information that I was going to present. So I'm going to use the same terminology or words to at least make you sound American. I sometimes myself question when I talk about all of this, how many of my students think that I'm being patriotic. Because with the headscarf and with a Muslim name, most of my students think I'm originally from Middle East. And I kind of trick them because I'm not. I'm originally from India. And every time they ask me, how do I look Middle Eastern? And I say, well, I'm a Muslim. And I did have the opportunity to live in Saudi Arabia for 5 years. Because of the time limit, I would like to focus on 3 of his very important sources of terrorism that he talked about, Mr. John Bercier talked about. And that's on clash of civilization, anti-Americanism, and religion. And as I was sitting and listening to him, it had a lot of meaning because for the last 10 years as an educator, I have been teaching multicultural education to my future teachers in the hope that they would prepare a better future where there would be more understanding and tolerance among each other. And every course, I had to emphasize on those 5 or 6 cultures that we have been emphasizing for years and years for now, the African American and the Hispanic and the Asian American and the Jewish American. And it was very interesting to see that in August 2001, as I became more confident in my own expertise in teaching multicultural education, I asked my students, I would like to design a course that would best meet to your needs. And I would like you to walk through the process of understanding and knowing better people whom you are afraid of or whom you do not know much. And we discussed about whether we should include the African American, Hispanic, and Asian American. And as I had assumed, they had enough knowledge of these cultures and they were more comfortable with these cultures for having been dealing with them for the last 50 or more years. And as I put down the countries or the people that they are afraid of or they would never want to visit, the countries were really very similar to what we are afraid of today as a nation, or concerned at least as a nation. And those were Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia and all the Middle Eastern and the Pakistan and all of that. So we tried to make a deal that we will present the education system that's prevalent in these countries so that we can understand why are they acting how they are acting. And in a month, September 11, the tragic incident hit. And I could see the very open and positive attitude that these students had to really understand what it is kind of changed a little bit, where they did not want to really hear or expose themselves more because they felt like it was all around them after September 11, and there was no point to really study these countries and find out what the reality is because it was really hitting the reality. Anyway, so putting these 3 into perspective, I would like to really focus on how I as an educator have come across these 3 really sources that have become the real sources of, I can vow that these are the sources for terrorism, at least from my perspective, teaching multicultural education. The first one, which he talked about, was about civilization and how it's different. It's very interesting to see how some of the cultural, at least the cultural practices that are done in the East, and we always consider East to be the opposite of the West, and we do not realize how much we are creating that damage by putting them on the opposite force of the West. And I have seen that some of the cultural practices do have very contrary. For instance, today, as the gentleman came to shake my hand, and I said, sorry, I do not shake hand. And that is very unfriendly, at least in the West, and it might be a very very common etiquette for Muslim women not to shake hands with Muslim men. Simple things like this, where little things really have a very opposite meaning into the context. And one example I share with my students is how the concept of dog is so much as a pet here in the West, where in some of the countries in the East, it is a security animal where people are very scared to have a dog around because all that he does is jumps and protects, the master. So these are different cultural patterns that we can understand where we are really having misunderstandings between civilization. As educators and teachers, we would like to emphasize that it's not right or wrong or what is good or bad, but it's just different. Different cultures, different civilizations, and different countries. And I thought that was very meaningful when he brought this out. Then talking about anti-Americanism, I moved to this country 25 years ago. And all that I heard about the United States, especially when I was in India, it was a paradise on earth. And I moved here, and it was confirmed because as I moved as a tourist, I just was confined to Disney World and SeaWorld and Orlando. And it was such a pleasure to be around people who just smile and do nothing but smile and are very friendly. And It's a Small World After All was my favorite song. And I felt like this is a world I would like to, if I had the resources to build, this is a real world I would build. And I was a teenager then, and I had this dream to move to the United States. And it so happened I moved and I settled down as an immigrant. And I moved to the New York City because at this time I was not anymore a tourist, but I was looking for a job. And the reality hit because the smiles were not there anymore. But people were more concerned about how I look and what my accent was and where I was from. So these are something important that as I walked through the journey of understanding cultures, I understood that multicultural education, or in fact any education to help students be productive citizens, is not a one-way process, but it's really a two-way process. I have to walk halfway and be willing to learn about other cultures so that they may be able to understand my own culture. And the third thing is about religion. I may, by the headscarf, appear to be religious, but I'm not. I just try to be modest and make my effort to be one. Religion has been a great controversial opinion in schools. And if we look at it very carefully, we will see that we are not talking about propagating religion, but we are talking about understanding. Because a lot of religions have their way of life has a lot to do with religion. And for some of us at least, God and religion is a very powerful word. And trying to understand what is the perspective of different people on religion can be a very helpful way of combating this source of information. Many of my students, even at the college level, had no idea that there were so many similarities between Judaism, Christianity, and Muslims. They were very shocked to know that I have to believe in Judaism and Christianity to be a Muslim. And they felt like, we thought it was all about terrorism, nothing about peace. To teach about religion, I very strongly believe that it can be used as a tool to save mankind rather than as a weapon to end mankind. And when we talk about religion, most of my teachers think that it's the law that we cannot even mention the word of religion. And we try to understand, to help them to look at the law very carefully, because it's not about expressing the tolerance and understanding the differences, that they understand this is not what they should do. I think it's very important to help children and students, our future leaders of this country, to understand that violence in schools is not the answer for a bigger violence. And as educators, we need to help them understand that anti-Americanism, at least from my perspective, when I was living in the Middle East or in other parts of the world 8 to 10 years ago, there was pro-Americanism. There were people that I came across, even Middle Eastern people, where they worshipped when I said, I am an American citizen. They had so much to look up to me to understand who I am and what my values and ideals are as an American citizen. And I carried the same positive image to my country back and talked about them. What my predecessor also talked about is how we can have the revolution of education where we can really change and bring in the anti-Americanism and kind of teach the reality of what U.S. is all about. I think it's time that we need to present to the United States and to the world at large who we really are, who we as American citizens really are, and what United States is really about. The fear of the unknown and the fear of the powerful. The powerful is there to help and protect the helpless, not to kind of gulp the weak and the helpless. I think these are important things, and while we talk about international, how we can really help through education combat racism, is because we would really like to use the ideology of teaching our students, not just here in the United States, maybe the world around, like some of the speakers mentioned, that even in Islamic schools around the world, where we have concerns about the Taliban or the people, how they are really indoctrinating the religion into a negative religion. Maybe it's time for us to kind of train Muslim educators around the world and teaching the children what the real way of teaching Islam is. Maybe it's time for us to really understand and educate our children here that the Muslims or the Middle East or the other parts of the world is not a terrorist. And the reason I'm trying to emphasize on being mainly about Middle East and Muslims is as I walk in the shopping centers and as I walked 20 years ago, I had that peace in me and I had that safety and security around me, which I no more feel sometimes when I walk into the shopping centers where people look around me and maybe assume that I'm a representative of Osama bin Laden or any other negative image that we have about Muslims or the world around. In fact, it did happen when my son was walking and he has a profile, he's dark and tall, and they said, oh, here is Osama bin Laden. And how do our students and our children react to this kind of negative attitude? And every skill that we have, although this might be very important for the law officials and the government policies to kind of emphasize on this homeland security, but I think as teachers and educators, it's very important because what we teach in our classrooms is what is happening in the world around us. And as we see United States as a leader in the world, we have even more responsibility to kind of train our students and our young generation to uphold those values and ideals of democracy and show the world what the real democracy is. And I really highly encourage that education programs and curriculum and instruction and new policies should be introduced where we kind of teach an ideology of what it is. Because in the history of American education, we have always looked upon schools as a reform and bringing reform in the country and in the world at large. And I think it's very important for us to bring that reform now and make sure that we have the proper training and the qualification being provided so these educators can really pass this true democracy and ideological principles of the United States and take them as a candle and as a flame and bring it to the beacon of light into the world and maybe end terrorism. And this is a different perspective from the educator's point of view. Because of the time limit, I would like to end here, and I really would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity.